So hi everyone, thank you very much to be with us today. We're going to start right on time now because the session is going to be pretty short, 1 hour 15 minutes. So thank you so much to be with us, and special thanks to CartONG and Martin in particular to have proposed this session, and we are very pleased to engage with him and various panelists that have been identified as well by CartONG. So this webinar is recorded. We're not going to do a presentation of each participant, but when you have a floor, and please be proactive through the chat or at any moment during the conversations and presentations, present your organization and yourself. So just briefly with regards to the panel, so me, it's Emmanuel Trunk from H2H Network. I'm going to facilitate this session, accompanied with Anna, of course, our communication officers, and at H2H. And so Martin gonna lead and present a bit the outcomes, the main outcomes from the study they have run during the past year, and where the report has been released and shared among the network recently. And it will be accompanied by Guido Pizzini from HiMap, that is pretty famous in the H2H network, and that are going to support a couple of reflections towards one of the outcomes. And with Guido Tsui from MTI, which we are really pleased to have you on board to give us a bit more reflection about the tech ecosystems functioning. So it's good to have these three panelists with us today. With regards to H2H, few words. I think everybody is aware of the fact that in the humanitarian health system today, data management, information management is really at the core of any conversations run by stakeholders, both in terms of strategies, but as well in practices, from donors to local actors, passing through the key humanitarian practitioners. So it's not a surprise that we have a solid group at H2H Network that is engaged in this activity to offer support services to humanitarian action. And we have definitely this data and information management and analysis pillar at H2H Network. We don't go too much in details in this list, but I think it shows the importance of data analysis within the sector, and also the value of agile and small organizations to support the health sector functioning with regards to data management. Just would like to say a word perhaps about H2H with regards to localization, and how do we see that, because I'm going to come later a bit when Martin's going to present the main outcomes, but just to let you know that for H2H Network, try to make a direct link between our services, and in particular data management and local practitioner is something pretty important now that have been also validated by the board. So that's why we are also very pleased to engage these conversations to see how we can fill some gap and contribute to better support local humanitarian practices. This said, I'm going to give the floor now to Martin, that's going to present briefly, rapidly in 10 minutes the main outcomes of the study, and kick off the conversations with him and the panelists. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Emmanuel. I will try to keep it short, even though it's a bit difficult because it's more than 100 pages of work, but I will summarize. So just a very quick word about CartONG for those who don't know us. We are H2H member NGO. We are supporting the international and humanitarian sector on data questions. And we'd like to present ourselves as a think and do tank. We are studying the datafication, if we can say, of the sector and its evolution, as well as we are practitioners of these technologies. So the study we're talking about today is a follow-up, actually, from a previous work we published in 2020. And it's part of a long-term initiative we have to support the data management practices of CSOs or NGOs, say as you want, which is funded by the French Development Agency. As part of this work, we are targeting support mainly to international humanitarian and international development CSOs, whether they are international per se or local and national. And we tried with this new work to expand a bit the scope with still some limitation. I will not enter into details. You'll find it in the study. Just a quick word about our sources, because it's important to know where we speak about. So we have reviewed more than 150 documents, which are mostly coming from the period since 2020, so mostly recent. We organized an online survey with 62 respondents from 54 organizations, which is of course not representative, but not bad either. We ran 18 interviews with key stakeholders, and we organized workshops with 78 participants, including one with HH members during the summer. So a few words about our key learnings. So first point we wanted to discuss is the aspect of data for what and whom, which is the entry point to our study. Because we all see the volume of data is exploding these days, but we have still, after careful review, still lacking of evidence on the impact of data on policymaking in particular and humanitarian planning in general. Data, according to CSOs, and I think we can say most actors, is still mainly collected for upwards accountability, so accountability for donors and contractual reporting. And at the same time, we still see quite a lot of questions on the impact of revolutionary tools. So we have some developments, for instance, on blockchain in the study with, like, I would say, a mitigated balance of these technologies. There are still very important gaps in data quality and huge biases in the way we collect data. So we also did with a clear global long development on the question of language, question of genders. And on this big topic of data quality, we can also say that as of today, qualitative data and secondary data are still largely underused in our sector, with a few promising artificial intelligence tools that could maybe help on this aspect of secondary data, but are not scaled up as of yet. We then reviewed a bit the state of the art, if I can say, of use of data in the sector. So what we can say is that the data as a concept as well as a professional field is more and more structured with large progresses. So what you can see on the bottom, for example, is part of a survey we asked about how they evaluate the digital literacy of the members of their CSOs. And as you can see, our respondents saw large progress. There is a pretty large development of skills with basic tools, which are still most used by organizations and in particular by local CSOs. When I say basic tools, we refer to Excel, mobile data collection, GIS. Those are the technologies that are still by far the most used by organizations. And most of our respondents and interviewees testified that the organizational level still remains somehow a challenge for many of their organizations, which means that individuals are getting better as they are gaining skills, but there is still a lack of processes, of tools, of organization, basically, towards data, which is linking to the question of data literacy that we also explore in the study. We then reviewed the question of the needs of CSOs. So what organizations told us is that there are a lot of tech solutions exist, but it's difficult for them to identify the right ones because, and it's kind of a central point that we will see all through the study and I guess all through the discussion, recurring lack of funding, first for needs assessments and then to define and find sustainable solutions. So put on the bottom a visual that we produced on like what would be the criterion for a CSO to find a sustainable solution. And as you can see, there is a variety of requirements. And so as I would say support organization, so this was for CartONG and other H2H, we identify that the goal is not so much to build new resources, develop new tools or new support offers, but mostly to target them at the right people, make them available, findable, and relevant to organizations. And you can see on the right another visual, which is what our respondents identified as key tech priorities, which is quite consistent with the rest of the report. And then to conclude on this very, very short introduction, I will just like list the core priority stakes that CSOs listed for us and that we explored in details in the report. Some of them will be covered a bit more in detail today, and some others you will find in the report. So they are prioritized in order of what the CSOs we interviewed put as most important. So the first one is data governance and localization. The second one is accountability to affected populations. So those two will be kind of the first broad topics that we will explore today. Then there was a question of decision-making based on data and solid and coherent strategies, which are quite linked. The question of data literacy that I already mentioned, which is kind of cross-cutting on everything. Questions of responsible data management, cybersecurity that we will tackle also as a focus today, and standardization and data sharing, which will be our third focus. And on the secondary stakes, there was a question of legal and contractual environment, which is also something that we'll discuss today, the responsible use of AI, which is kind of completely cross-cutting in most topics today, and the question of sustainability and master technological environment, which connects also to the question of governance of the sector. So as you can see, it's a pretty broad spectrum. I have unfortunately no time to get in details on all of them, but we'll cover some of them, and I will give you small hints of CartONG's research before opening the discussion with our panelists as we tackle the different topics. So over to you, Emmanuel.
Thank you very much, Martin. And as you see, we have identified a couple of topics we would like to reflect, and definitely one is around all this localization ambition in the humanitarian sector, and the importance to better understand, first of all, how local actors, as you name it, CSOs, civil societies organization, and local actors, local service providers, as well as we have tried through recent report H2H Network to identify their challenges and how do they approach, this notion of data, because they were collecting information and data before all of this reflection about localization was existing. So there are various things we need to see as important to discuss. And perhaps as a first follow-up, Martin, you were mentioning in your report at least a risk of two-tier humanitarian sector systems functioning, a risk. And can you explain more in details what you see related to this and related to localization, please?
Yeah, of course. So we took this expression 2 tiers because it's something that we often see, like classifying CSOs or humanitarian actors in tiers with like the big global ones and like medium one and smaller ones. And what we saw as part of the report is that if we look at the data angle, it's more and more like really a division in two. So with less and less intermediate levels. With on the one side, what we could call the global organization, so it's mostly the United Nations systems, a few major CSOs or NGOs, but really like the big global ones, and some global north institutions like the national statistic offices, the development agencies of the global north country. And on the other side, you have, well, all the rest. So it's like most of the global south institutions, local and national CSOs, but also a larger part of I would say, medium-sized north NGOs and most of the organizations actually from our sector. And how do we see this divide is that on the one side, we have organizations who have the resources, the skills, the capacity to embed innovation. If we take, for instance, the example of artificial intelligence is an excellent example of that, with only a few very big organizations which have the capacity as of now to really embed it in their processes. And so ultimately, organizations that have an agenda on one side and that also have the leverage to deal with private sector providers and not be only like using the tools that they are given and also having some agenda on defining the tools. And on the other side, well, most of the organizations don't have these capacities, like their staff is being hired by bigger organizations. They don't have the resources to have sustainable functions, or at least not big enough to what they would be needing, and they are mostly like subject to innovation, if I caricature a little bit. So what we see out of that is that there is a huge need for to develop basic skills, literacy, and develop data structures everywhere. So we put here a visual of like a broad like a synthesis of the sector the way we saw it. But the thing behind that is that well, there is a need for a pretty structural change of the governance of the sector if we want to solve all these big questions and avoid having this two-tier system only getting worse in the future.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'm sure when we, after the panelist conversations, there will be a couple reaction from our participants with regards to this slide in particular, what you have presented. Perhaps before I give the floor to Guido, you have mentioned a lot in your reflection, Martin, in your study about the policies and how the sectors has made serious progresses with regards to the use of data and data information management. Okay, do you see any specific remaining gaps you would like to tackle today and share to the participants?
So if I stick to this question of localization, which is a vocabulary debate in itself, so I will try to keep it simple. Basically, there are several organizations, including the late development initiative that was a big source for reports and that we will sorely miss at CartONG, on the fact that there is a need currently to build a data backbone in many countries. So also collaborated with national statistics offices, with local governments, and like, for instance, in the sectors of health, in the sectors of education, with the ministries, with the hospitals, with the regional management of the education system, to really like build this data infrastructure that allows to collect and get the data upward and then analyze it, and not only arrive as international organization and ask for data that we need at some point, but without building a sustainable system that can be used by local actors. We need a conversation, I think, at the system level. Of course, it's not people in the room that can decide it's not the CSOs, it's not the H2H organization, but I think we can get better at advocacy on this angle to really like try to create a system reform towards that direction.
Okay, thanks. And so perhaps Guido, as you are an important member of H2H, and HiMap has also main expertise in data management. I would be very pleased to hear from you a bit your reflections towards the landscape in the sector with regards data, and also how do you see the role of H2H members, as mentioned by Martin, perhaps playing a more advocacy and lobbying role for paying attention to these elements, but to tackle the challenges or some specific challenges, what do you see as important, please?
Thank you, Emmanuel, and Martin, for having me here with you today, and well done, Martin and CartONG, on this very timely and relevant study. I mean, I think if we look at the landscape, even beyond the data landscape, the needs overall are growing from a humanitarian perspective globally. It's without any doubts, and the donor availability of resources is shrinking, unfortunately so. And so I think that H2H organizations, especially those who are working on everything that is data related, and especially if we want to, move really into the localization component of these data work streams and some of the findings that Martin shared with us, and for us to be able to achieve those work streams, the only way forward that we foresee at IMAP, and that I personally foresee, is really the engagement through strategic and operational partnerships. We need to mutualize our efforts. We need to maximize the resources that we have available, so that we can avoid duplication and we can actually really start implementing the way of doing coordinated data ecosystems at the field level. I think, Martin, there's one slide that you showed before where you were mentioning that we're still too much serving like the audiences at headquarters level, and a lot of the data efforts are still too focused on an audience that is, yes, needed, because often that's where decisions are taken and that's where the sort of decision makers are sitting. But if we want to really achieve some of these components that you've been mentioning, Martin, I think that we really need to shift the narrative and really target localized stakeholders at the country level. A humanitarian access is by day increasing in terms of a constraint for us to operate. Our humanitarian space is shrinking a lot in various contexts. And the only way forward for us to really be relevant and to really be able to provide timely, accurate, and reliable data is to engage with those local stakeholders, but not engaging with local stakeholders, just, implementing them and embedding them in our proposals, saying, we're going to contract this organization because, so we tick the box of localization, but it's really, how can we engage with them? How can we have strategic conversations? And how can we shift the narrative for them to be at the center of the discussions, for them to be the ones that are telling us how to do the things on the ground? This is something that we are absolutely committed to at IMAP, and I think that this is something that, again, through the H2H network, is something that we really look forward to engaging with CartONG amongst other stakeholders that are part of the network, and I think this is where we can really play together a differential going forward. Thank you, Emmanuel.
Thank you, Guido. Would you like to respond to or add anything, Martin, on this element?
Yeah, maybe I have to do the transition to the next topic that Guido already started to cover, which was this whole question of pooling resources, building standards, and supporting the sector capacities at large. So I put two illustrations from, well, one visual and one quote that we took in the study. The first one on the left is actually coming from the workshop we did with H2H network members in August, and we asked participants, I think we had around 30 staff members from a variety of data H2H specialists, a good number of IMAP, but also from Action, HOT, etc. And we asked our colleagues, what do you think are the key technology opportunities for tomorrow? And I was quite surprised to see that data standards and APIs were the top two coming out first, before machine learning and other actual new technologies, which is completely consistent with what you are saying, Guido. It's like we have a lot of progresses to do in improving what we are doing currently and like building more connections, basically. There are, of course, very nice progresses that have been made. We can only mention HGX, which has been a huge success in many aspects, but it's not enough in itself. It's also what I was mentioning on secondary data before. And I would like to expand a bit the reflection, and maybe Guido and also Guido and Emmanuel, you would want to comment on that. But what we saw in our study is that we cannot disconnect the question of humanitarian data with broader questions of, first, the evolution of the digital world in general. And I think what happened yesterday in the US is, of course, also impacting us, even though we are a small sector in the global digital industry, but we're still part of it, with the whole question of the influence of big tech companies, the aspect of, what we would call techno-solutionism. So trying to find always a technical solution to a problem that is not always linked to technology. And in general, the question of sustainability of solutions. And the second big aspect that we need to also take into account is the more global question of innovation. And what room is left for innovation in a world of like increasing and many now dare to say excessive accountability requirements, bureaucratization in general of the sector. And I will conclude with the quote on the right, which is coming from a study that ALNAP published, which was super interesting. It's one of the only studies that have been done on humanitarian innovation, actually, I think. I mean, tech innovation, like data innovation. And what they found out is that pretty good progresses, but most of the funding is still directed towards pilot initiative and like this kind of test and never to scaling up. And so that they cannot really assess the proper impact that data and technology could have in the sector, because it's never really tried, actually. And most of the time, we remain at this pilot test stage. And it's extracted from another study, some like global figures on innovation in the humanitarian sector. And I find it quite striking that they've identified that the level of research and development investment in the humanitarian sector is at the same level than in the paper industry, to give you a point of comparison. So not maybe the place where you expect the most innovation. And at the same time, with this very limited level of innovation, we managed to have decent results. But what could happen if we had the scale and the means to do so?
Thank you, Martin. And I think, yeah, we're going to discuss briefly a bit this the technology dimension of the data collection and data management in the humanitarian sector. While it's true there seems to be a discrepancy between the requirements from donors with regards to INGOs or local NGOs, and the opportunity to engage more in these tech elements to make sure we tackle the main elements. So I think it's not easy to link the two, at least from a humanitarian perspective. But Guido, can you jump in on this and perhaps start to discuss a bit what do you see as this practice of responsible data as part of the aid system?
Thank you, Manuel. I think even before jumping into the responsible data, I wanted to share a past personal experience. And the thing that for me resonates here a lot, Martin, is like when we talk about innovation, we're all the time focused on a software or a piece of tech, while often the innovation can and should sit as well with individuals, with human beings, with people. And so back in the days, I was working with an organization responding to a cyclone, and I was deployed on the ground. We started, processing satellite imagery analysis, and we started doing all the traditional work that we would normally be doing, which from a scientific modeling perspective was absolutely accurate and was absolutely relevant. The images were telling us where damage had occurred. And so the sort of strategic planning was taking place following those tech-driven innovative recommendations. Again, from a scientific model, absolutely valid. But by talking to local people that were working in our offices, national staff, drivers, everybody, they were asking us, why were we going to XY location instead of going to ABC location? And so we started having conversations with them. And one thing that was never factored, that is hard to factor in those tech-driven innovations, is the knowledge of local communities and what were the actual coping mechanisms. And they were telling us that those communities that were living on the coastal areas were used, unfortunately, to be exposed to that type of cyclones. And so what they were doing was they were removing the stainless steel roof, putting it underground, because one, it could cause harm if it flies away. And second of all, that was what actually cost a lot of money in case it flies away. Everything was flooded in the houses. Yes, true. But after 3 days, if we had reprocessed the imagery, which we actually did, those houses that for us were appearing as damaged without roofs actually had the roofs back in place. While the cyclone, due to climate change, was actually pushing further in beyond and far from coastal areas. And what was happening is that it was exposing people that were not necessarily used to that type of natural hazard. And so again, in terms of the innovation, it was super accurate, but what we were missing was to capture in that innovation the localized context of coping mechanisms. And what I see missing in all the tools that we're developing and we've been developing over the years is how can we really listen to local communities that are affected directly or indirectly by those disasters and crises? And how can we really shift the narrative in that regards? And that applies as well to everything that is related to data responsibility and the ethical use of data. We are often and really putting a lot of fatigue on communities when it goes out in regards to surveys and data collection exercises. We've got better, I must say. I think, Martin, you alluded to an example and a point related to positivity, which is true, because things have drastically improved in the last 15 years in the ecosystem of information management. But at the same time, we still have to do giant steps to really achieve positive results that are sustainable, that are actually cross comparable between contexts. We have very good examples of where this type of innovation has been successful, where tools have been implemented in a fantastic way, where data collection standards have been applied to the rule. But as of today, still today, we have a few exceptions where all of this was successful. We don't have a comprehensive way of doing the whole ecosystem of information management with all the H2H partners all together in a way that it actually is replicable and scalable. And again, considering what are the challenges that we could be facing in the different contexts, and how can we really make sure that it's not, you know, an Italian, a German, a French, and an English that is deploying, going to somebody somewhere to tell them how to do things. But we have to be really identifying those data champions, those leads at the national level, at the subnational level, that can actually take ownership of these processes. Because again, it goes as well too much with a top-down approach still today. Over.
Thank you, Guido. And so we enter now in our third and last part of the panel before having the chance to open the floor for the participants. And with regards to this responsible data and how to connect or reconnect the existing knowledge and the intelligence that exists already on the ground, perhaps I would like to give the chance to Guido to offer some perspective about the tech eco sector, and how do you see some specific challenges for the humanitarian sector to reflect and face this notion of responsible data management, and what you see as important to pay attention considering the evolution of the system. Thank you, Quito, and welcome.
Thank you, Emmanuel, and thank you for having me here today. I'm Quito, and I'm with the MELTech initiative, which, if you're not familiar with it, is an organization that provides holistic program implementation, advisory support around MEL technologies and digital programming. And we're focused on the responsible design, use, and governance of digital technologies and digital data. In terms of the question that you asked, Manuel, about the kind of most critical challenges, I think it's hard to narrow it down, but to kind of group the challenges and where they come from, I think the first is definitely a kind of meta framework reflection, right? In that I think the sector is very prone to seeing tech tools and the evolution of tech tools as disconnected moments, right? And the real challenge is trying to think of a way to connect up all of these technologically related decisions and data collection decisions, because it's really easy to get distracted when new ways of technology emerge. And I think it's almost seen as this like Rubicon moment where you cross the bank from one technology, right, blockchain, to biometrics, and biometrics to AI, and then that shifts the focus. But actually these tools build on one another. They can augment each other. They can change the way that the previous tools that have been implemented are experienced. And that interplay, I think, is really important to understand for us to think about in terms of how the sector has evolved and how in many ways it's actually stuck dealing with the legacy of past choices. And as a sector, I think there needs to be a more robust approach to thinking about how to look back and revisit previous conversations to update understanding. And in particular, I'm thinking about, as new tools are used, what that means for previous decisions, for instance, around collecting data. What kind of new risks emerge when we've already collected extensive amounts of biometric data that is connected to extensive amounts of identifiable information, right? Within these databases, a lot of times raw biometrics. So if they are, for whatever reason, access that the people who it's attached to are entirely unprotected, right? We haven't, as we think about using new tools like AI, it's important to go back and think about the data that we've already collected and the reasons why we collected that in the first place. And that, I think, is why it's important to think about this as a big chain where we are taking understanding we already have and building on it and moving it forward, right? So we don't neglect those fundamentals about why we're collecting data, who we're collecting it for, if it's necessary in the first place to have all of that data, because I think it imperils other work we're trying to do and can also introduce new risks in regards to new tools, but also those new tools can introduce risks regarding data that has been previously collected. The second would be embedding big tech tools and big tech companies within the humanitarian sector. There's a real reliance on tools provided by big tech companies and not a lot of reflection around what it means to utilize both in kind of informal ways, things like ChatGPT, right, on a personal level, or in more formalized ways as part of humanitarian workflows, what that means for the neutrality of humanitarian organizations, what the actual interest and reason as to why big tech companies are providing their services, right? They have a real interest in accessing more data and what that means to give them access to the data of people in incredibly vulnerable circumstances and the kind of implications that has for informed consent, but also kind of the things that both Emmanuel, you talked about at the beginning, and Guido just now about what these tools mean for participation, right? I think it's a real risk that it reinforces certain kinds of participation, certain kinds of logic of the sector over others, right? And that's not just around participation, but that's also in relation to the responsible data piece around, I think, tools like, again, like a generative AI tools, but also AI tools, I think underpin that same logic of data maximization, collecting as much as we can and feeding it into the system to gain insights, as opposed to reflecting on what sources of information do we need and what actually are we trying to do with that. And equally, when we're thinking about connecting up, when we think about responsible data management in the sector, it's also about responsible data management vis-a-vis what the broader tech ecosystem looks like. And I think the harms that big tech companies and these tech tools introduce, environmental damage, information distortion, algorithmically incited violence outside of the humanitarian sector, still come to bear in the sector, right? And what does it mean to be utilizing these tools that create or can contribute to exacerbating the conditions that lead to humanitarian crises in the last place. And the last thing I will say is that responsible data management is about necessity, it's about data minimization, but it's also about thinking of other ways to achieve the same outcomes, right? And the real risk is overlooking the contributions or importance of low tech, low connectivity alternatives, right? Things like biometrics require a lot of knowledge, require a lot of technological capacity in order to do it, right? But actually, on the field, a lot of research that I've conducted it shows that data access is often done like via the sharing of things like spreadsheets, right? It's still a lot more mundane because on the ground, the facts on the ground is that it's not always possible in the immediacy of an enormous crisis or conflict or environmental destruction, right, to be able to roll out these kind of really complicated tech tools. So we spend all this money and we expose people to a lot of risk for tools that actually might not be usable, at least not initially, but also often across lots of different kinds of contexts that humanitarians work in. So I think it's important to think about what the alternatives are and to get really specific about that as well, right? I think that's a really important part of data management, responsible data management, to think about how particular tools introduce risk. The last thing I'll say here is that at MTI, we worked on a report with Catholic Relief Services, which should be out shortly, about alternatives to biometrics and deduplication. And I think what that conversation introduces is a lot more nuance about the tool and the use case and how we can actually match them up in a much more intentional fashion rather than this kind of broad brush techno-solutionist fashion where we have something we want to use and we try to apply it often in a context where it's not going to work and it's going to require humanitarians to expose both themselves and communities to a lot of risk. So I'll stop there, but thank you.
No, thank you so much, Guido, for all of these detail elements. And before we open the floor, I just would like to give a chance to Martin, based on the outcomes of the study, if you have any last observation, reflections towards how, practically speaking, it works with data responsible management, with all of this notion in environment, as explained Guido as well, about limited access where data collection is really a challenge and put at risk the key stakeholders on the ground, and where probably there is a kind of sophistication, ambition while the basic data requirements are not there yet. So do you have any main outcomes from your study you want to share on that?
Yeah, just to complete, I think one of the key points of the study is that humanitarian actors maybe need to be a bit less naive, if I could say, about this whole data question, because we own data of a very high value regarding some of the most vulnerable populations in the world. And this data is interesting to many people. Of course, governments were used to that. Of course, malicious actors that perform cyber attacks to sell the data, etc., etc. But we also need to take a frank look at the agenda of big tech companies. And I will conclude with an extract from a report that was dug out by a development initiative. Is coming from a position paper of the Information Technology Industry Council. So it's probably not an organization you know. It's kind of the lobby of big tech companies in the US, actually. And this produced a recommendation to the US government, and I quote, as I recommend that the United States can no longer afford to support nations whose actions are against US techno-economic interests. This would mean no more aid to countries that impose data localization or other digital protectionist tools. So I think this resonates quite a lot in today's context, unfortunately, and which means that all that we are discussing currently in terms of localization, responsible data, etc., we need to be aware this goes against the interest of certain actors, and these actors are very potent in our technology world.
Thank you, and thanks for the three panelists to have engaged in this presentation and conversation. So now the floor is open, and it's great. We have 35 minutes to give a chance to all our participants. 72 participants today. So I would like to make sure each of you has a chance to raise any particular points, react to the presentations or what has been said, and offer some perspective and field example illustrations from your own organization. So please, the floor is open, and don't hesitate also to provide some elements through the chat. Don't be afraid, please. I see you, Christina, and I'm sure you have things to say. So I would be pleased to give you the floor.
Okay, so I've been put on the spot here. Well, I think, first of all, really thank you for doing this report. I think it is such an important subject that's also very, very challenging. And I think I need to sort of also read the whole report in more detail and think about many of the really important issues you've raised. The things that are perhaps most at forefront of my mind now, and that I think I want to turn into a question here, is something that comes out of an exercise I'm currently, if I'm honest, forced to do around our data responsibility. It has been requested by HDX in response to sort of our data, and it is a process that's been dragging for sort of 3-4 months already, and this is now sort of my question that comes from this. We are really having endless back and forth on the fact that good data responsibility for the humanitarian sector seems to be based around principles that the moment you apply them in practice happen to be in tension with each other. And then it becomes an issue of defining which of the various principles, whether it is data use over security of data or protection of personal identifiable information versus applicability of data to use cases, all of these issues then becomes a question of defining which principle of responsible data use trumps the other, to what extent, in what context. And we are now at a document of close to 60 pages, trying to going through all sorts of different possible issues around it. So that's my description of my suffering at the moment, trying to work through that. So my question now, did you sort of come across that issue as well? And what do you think of these tension between different principles, responsibility, quality, security, objectives, the way that Guido sort of said, you know, you need to bring in all these different perspectives and all of these things. So yeah, what is the best guiding principle to say you turn that into something practical, if anyone has some sort of good ideas to share there? Sorry, it was a bit rambling, but I'm yeah, very sort of deep in this issue at the moment.
Thank you very much, Christina. And perhaps before giving the floor to the panelists, I would like to take one or two more questions from the participants. Any reflection? Any things you would like to share, please?
Yeah, hi, this is Ralph Winters. I'm with Statistics Wars. Hi, everyone.
Hi. Please go ahead.
So, kind of related to those last two questions, I guess you know we're finding with privacy, you know, which we everyone's concerned about. A lot of times, you know, between the different privacy rules, you know, here in the US and in the EU, we're kind of being flooded with, before we do projects, what looks like a set of restrictions that look like they were drafted by lawyers. And not that there's anything wrong about it, but it's sort of like inhibiting our ability to kind of, you know, help people. And so I guess my question is, what is, from an all-volunteer organization, what's a reasonable stance to take towards that, you know, to try to help organizations without getting into the intricacies of signing agreements and possibly forcing our volunteers to sign agreements? And, you know, I would hate to have volunteers being sued and stuff like that. So it's kind of related to the two questions before, but it's hampering what we could do a little bit.
Thank you very much. And let's start with these two folds of questions. So I give the floor to Guido first. What do you think?
Yeah, I think two big questions for sure. In terms of, I think the kind of key, what I see as a line maybe connecting between them is about what's the reasonable standard, and I guess what's the maybe simplest, most efficient entry point into figuring out how to pass these kind of legal parameters or different principles as well as they might be. I think the initial, in regards to Christina's question, the initial thing I would say is probably a barometer of necessity is easiest to figure out. First of all, like whether you need to use that tool, how to pass that tool itself, and then the data that might be required as part of it, and to really consider that as a framework to then filter other things. I think that, for instance, whether or not you use informed consent or legitimate interest as the basis, that actually preceding both of those things to me would be some kind of mark of necessity. And that's a way to maybe make it a bit more practical, first of all, as a singular guiding principle. I think that obviously the classic one that this is married up with in relation to Ralph's question is a principle of do no harm. What that means in practice when these things start to come into tension, I think, can look very different across settings, which is why I do feel like the necessity piece can be very helpful in the first instance. A lot of times when we collect data or decide to use a tool, it's actually not fundamentally necessary. There is a simpler, slightly less risk averse, probably less technologically advanced way to do that. I know that I'm bouncing around between the questions I'm trying to answer, I guess, both to a degree. The one thing I think I could contribute towards Ralph's question is that I think a lot of these things seem more complicated than they are. That strong, responsible data management is a holistic approach that can help you figure out whether or not you should be sharing data and whether or not you're endangering somebody as part of that. And I think some of those considerations are about how much capacity you have to protect that piece of information. All data has risks related to it. All data sharing has risks related to it. You have to decide, both I think for Christina and Ralph's situation, whether or not those risks are worth whatever it is you're trying to do with that data, of which I would contest most times out of 10 that's probably not the case. So I think it's less about these data rules and regulations getting in the way. It's more about having a clear understanding about why we have them in the first place, and operating with that in mind, I think would mean that you're always in a strong position when you come to those in potentially tense trade-off situations or moments where it seems like it's more legalistic than it at first appears necessary. So that's kind of my initial two cents, but I'll hand back to Manuel to keep going with the discussion.
Great, Quito, and I give the floor to Guido now.
Thank you, Manuel. And maybe even for us to reflect, and there's amazing work done by other H2H organizations and partners. There's as well a data responsibility working group that takes place under the stewardship of the Global Information Management Working Group. I think there's colleagues from the Center of Humanitarian Data that are on this call as well, who can provide eventually more information. So it's taken very seriously. The challenge that I face is that often those guidelines, those policies, those guiding documents are often very complicated for a lot of people to understand in terms of what it actually means. And you know, there's ways as well, again, to go with the localized efforts to tackle those challenges, to go to the field with, you know, simple checklists that can actually mitigate those risks. You don't need to be a lawyer in data protection to understand how to mitigate those risks and how to avoid exposing people and vulnerable communities to those risks. But often just a very basic checklist can help actually mitigate those challenges and those risks. And again, we need to look at how can we, as an H2H community, advocate for those data responsible principles to be adopted on a day-to-day basis across the board. Because if we just hand, you know, a big interagency standing committee guideline and send it over email to our local partners, it's not going to fly, because, you know, often those documents are 50, 60, 70, 80, 100 pages, and you need to be a lawyer to understand them. I would, again, back to Quito's point as well, you know, GDPR and all these major laws and regulations are fantastic that are there. But again, what we need to really consider is that at the end of the whole line, there's vulnerable communities. And if we are not able to protect them, yes, we might get a fine from a government eventually, but the fine does not actually save the people's life down the road. And we need to focus on those communities that we put at risk if we do things without an ethical and principled approach.
Thanks, Guido. Martin, would you add something before I give back the floor? And thanks, Bernard, for your comments around this and the recommendations you made.
Yeah, I will answer on the two previous questions, then we will move on. Just on this question of like recommendations, etc., it directly connects to what we identified, which is question of access to resources and support, which is quite disseminated today. There are actually quite a lot of things available, but for most smaller organizations, they don't even know where to start to find. And I must say, even us as CartONG, we don't really have the solution, because we built this whole portal to centralize resources around the data practices, which is the one, it's on the ALNAP website. So it's where we upload the studies that I'm sharing. And we can see that it's not even the solution yet. So it's probably contributing, but it's not enough. So it's a big question. And just a bit more on the second question on like what could be the reasonable stance, as you put against what we could call over excessive accountability. There is no one-fit-all solution about that, of course. Part of it is, of course, like beefing up your own processes to be able to demonstrate when you are required that you can cope with like data protection regulations. But part of it will probably be in the future to resist to it. And we take in the study an example, which is actually the biggest fight, if I can say, that French CSOs had with their own the public development agencies, the French development agencies, the ones funding our study actually, was on this question of data of beneficiaries. And So they went up to the administrative Supreme Court in France to try to contest regulation, and they actually won in terms of consistency with GDPR, etc. at the French level. But they had to at some point there were some boycott of meetings and this kind of stuff. And it's interesting to see that the biggest conflict that happened between the French NGOs and their main donor was around actually data and responsible data. So it's just an example. I'm not saying everyone should do that, of course, but it shows the importance of this stake. And I think most actually of the CSOs that were involved in this movement didn't really realize it was a responsible data management question at first. But now that we explain to them that they have to maybe be more proactive into dealing with these stakes and not waiting to be put in front of regulations that are unacceptable in terms of humanitarian principles, we hope that they will get proactive on that.
Thank you, all of you, for your responses. And I'm going to give the floor to Nathaniel, and also I would like to give a chance that we reply to Emily and Bernard on this, putting affected people in the picture when we are doing ecosystem diagram. But Nathaniel, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, and fantastic presentation. Before I move to my substantive question, I just like to find out if the recording will be shared. I think that will be extremely helpful to serve, as a reference, in most of our dealings and all that. So I believe that will be extremely helpful. My question is in relation to the responsible data management. I noticed that you projected 4 key areas, looking at security, quality and all that, and the other 2 that's attached to it, which was brilliant. But if you expand it a little bit in terms of data quality management, well, I didn't really get that in the presentation. So I just want to find out how that falls within that 4 core areas that has been indicated when it comes to responsible data management, or is something that has been encompassed in these 4 areas. I think a little bit information around that will be helpful, whether that was deliberate or it was an omission. Thank you.
Thanks for this question. Can we have 1 or 2 more questions before we give the floor back to our panelists?
Maybe you can also take Bernard's question in the chat, actually.
Yes, so, but I think, Quito, you reply already to one of the elements. But yeah, I wanted to come to the chat later on. But if there is any last comments or questions from the participants, please don't hesitate. If not, if everything was so clear. So yes, Emily, yeah, welcome, nice to see you. And please, you have the floor.
Hi there. I just feel so conflicted about this issue when we're working with local communities. I mean, on the one hand, I think there's a lot of incidental data that humanitarian sector organizations are collecting, and that just might be attendance lists of people that we give per diems to or transport money to. And in the LGBTIQ area that we work in, even that kind of incidental data can be a real challenge for organizations to manage and for the security of affected people. And so on the one hand, I mean, that kind of management of incidental data seems to be really important. And then if we think about sort of intentional data collection, I mean, I think a lot of smaller LGBTIQ organizations are really caught here because they're existing in a humanitarian sector in which we're told that there has to be evidence-based decision-making. We have to have data for, to justify, funding of programs, or the way that programs are designed, how many people are going to be reached, and so forth. But in the LGBTIQ space, that data is really dangerous to collect, often really impractical to collect. And the reality is, in this foreseeable future, it's not going to be collected. And in many cases, donors and larger organizations deliberately decide not to collect it because they don't want to put communities at risk. And so then we're sort of on this fork. We're in a system that requires data in order to justify what we do, but then a system which is incapable and probably would be unwise to even try to collect a lot of the data that is supposedly required in order for us to justify our programs. And I don't know what to do with that question, honestly. Help is the question.
Okay. Thank you so much, Emily, for your illustration and question. So I just would like to give the floor now back to our panelists. First, to respond to Rachela. I think there was on your chat questions around AI reflections and what are the limits of the use of AI. We have Nathaniel's questions and to end by Emily. And so just having 3 minutes each of you, and after giving a chance to Martin to offer conclusions based on the study. And please, so perhaps Guido first.
Thank you. And Emily, I mean, the question you ask is like it's the elephant in the room. For me, and based on my experience, what really makes what we refer to in the humanitarian system as an information management officer, a good information management officer, is not necessarily how good they are in coding skills and dashboarding and visualization and all of those things. It's somebody that is actually able to be a people's person and build trust and build his or her network on the ground. And that can apply between colleagues and peers, your supervisors, but it can absolutely apply as well with communities once we are going to the field to collect data and to engage with those communities on the ground. If we're not able to build that trust, again, there's a lot of policies, there's a lot of laws, there's a lot of guidelines on ethical and responsible data collection methods. But if somebody is not able to do it with a way that they're building that engagement and that trust with communities, you're not going to get any sort of data at the end of the day. And it's all about being transparent. It's all about being really honest on how and what we will be doing with eventually those data points that we're collecting. So it's not a perfect answer. I know it's not satisfying probably for you, Emily, but again, that's for me where it's the only way we can tackle it. Because if you're just sending a survey for the sake of sending a survey with a lot of awkward questions in it, you're never going to get it, and especially if you're not able to give something backwards. Just quickly on Bernard's point, I think, Bernard, I fully agree with you. I refer to, we're in the generation of dashboard fever. Everybody wants a dashboard. Everybody wants to visualize the data and make the fanciest of the dashboards. Often we're not able to really understand what the data means versus what the data is saying. And that for me is where the challenge is. We put data points on the dashboard, but we don't even have then the ability to explain and analyze those data points and actually refer to what they mean rather than what they're saying as data points. I think there's another comment that is about, having populations affected being at the center of the discussions. This I'll hand it over to Martin. What I really want to put emphasis on the study that Martin and CartONG have been doing is that if we look at the respondents and the engagement that they've had, half, or if not more, were local stakeholders and local organizations. I have never seen such a broad study done in regards to data and information management in the humanitarian ecosystem that has that sort of ratio that is inclusive of all those local national stakeholders. And that for me is something that we need to, really give the credits to CartONG for having done that exercise in that regards, because that's where we're really capturing inputs and voices from those that are often left behind, unfortunately. So well done, Martin and CartONG, and over to you.
Thank you, Guido. Quito, any additional elements, particularly on Nathaniel's question, and as well Rachela on AI?
Yes, on Rashda's question, very, very quickly, I think a good rule of thumb is to not put any sensitive beneficiary or affected population data into ChatGPT or any other third-party provider AI tool. That's because you cannot guarantee how that information is processed or shared. You can do certain things like making sure it doesn't record your conversations, essentially. Like, you can turn that off in the settings, but I think that that's a really good rule of thumb. And as you already picked up on, we don't know, it's partly about where databases are located, but it's also partly about how these interactions are then used to train AI models. And that part is very difficult to pass on the outside because big tech companies won't let us take a look at that. think Nathaniel's question was about data quality management. It wasn't a purposeful omission, just for the interest of time. I think that those are the bigger challenges, but I think that data quality management is an ongoing question and challenge, which I think speaks a lot to the kinds of conditions, like I said, that humanitarians are operating in, which leads me, I think, to my final reflection and somewhat in relation to some things that Emily was saying is about the push for collecting data in the first place. The reason why, in part, the data quality management question arises is because the extent, scope, and detail of the data necessary to make humanitarian communities that humanitarians are working with legible both to humanitarian organizations themselves and to donors, right? And it's this force of legibility that then requires all these other data questions to be answered. Obviously, some data is probably always going to be collected in the sector, but it's important to think about data as a sort of fundamentally toxic thing. Like once you have it, you must do something with it. You need to protect it, you need to store it, you need to organize, analyze, process it, right? And even if it just sits there and does nothing, you still need to do things in relation to it then. So I think, and in the process, what it does is forces us to try to quantify as humanitarians and practitioners our work, right? And that puts communities like LGBTQI plus individuals at the particular sharp edge of it, right? So I think the point is to say is, as in the background of all of these discussions, the thing that we're not asking ourselves is why we need all of this data in the first place. There are other ways to think about how to help people that don't require data. For instance, if it's about dispersal of funds in a moment of crisis, satellite imagery would allow you to count very quickly a rough estimate of how many people would be arriving at a certain spot to disperse immediate funds there and then, right? Equally, knowing that XYZ villages are probably going to be hit by a typhoon, you have a rough sense of the population, you can do relatively decent mathematics based on that, right? That has a small margin of error, but should be compared against the cost of collecting all this data, storing all this data, processing, analyzing, going back to dashboards, all these other concurrent elements that take away from directly interfacing with communities, directly understanding what it is that they need, and can be a real distraction. So I know that that is somewhat provocative and a little bit sly, but I think the point of that is to say that we work in the way we do because it's how it's always been. But actually, it puts us in really difficult positions. That means that communities broadly that humanitarians work with, and also specific groups that are especially vulnerable, might be left out because we force this worldview that isn't necessary or isn't, I think a status quo we have to accept writ large. So that would be my closing remarks, and I'll hand over to Emmanuel.
Thank you very much, Quito. And so, Martin, you have the floor to respond to the different questions where you see some elements to share, and perhaps to offer some conclusion and next steps reflections, because we hope it's only the first conversations we have together on that regard. Yeah.
Yeah,
Please.
thanks a lot, Emmanuel, and thanks for your comments. So I will not go into details on different questions. I would just say that both on all of these aspects, you will find some more detailed chapters on the study, like on data quality. We have done some work, and also we refer quite a lot to the work of our peers from other specialized H2H organizations. So I mentioned some of them, but for instance, on this question of data quality, the work of Ground Truth Solutions is very inspiring. On the question of biases, you can check the work of Clear Global. On the question of participation, you can find organizations like HOT, which are also very inspiring. The Engine Room on the question of ethical stakes, etc., etc. So I'm really happy when we do it. It's the second webinar we do to present the study. The first one was more for a Francophone audience. And I'm really happy to see all our peers are kind of converging on this common position. And now, and that will do the transition to the conclusion, we need to be more active on making that a reality, if I could say, what we wish for the sector. So I won't present to you in detail the whole recommendations we produce. I'm just showing you the overall slide. So we did some recommendations for CSOs, for network heads, for all actors, but also for H2H organizations, the last one. So I hope it will inform our discussions Some of them are directly consistent with the common positions that we produced a joint statement with IMAP, Migration, and other organizations last summer. So they also fed into these recommendations, try to be consistent. And really, to the conclusion itself on my side is like, sometimes when I present the study, it's a bit like people are a bit like, oh my God, there's so much to cover, we'll never have the means, etc. And actually, we are quite surprised in the last questions of the survey to see that, well, our panelists, and specifically local CSOs, felt much more equipped to tackle all these challenges. So I don't know if it's because they are more aware of it, and like there is a greater skills in organization, which makes them feel they can cover it more, because from our point of view, the ecosystem is certainly not easier to tackle these days, but at least we see that NGO staffs and data professionals from the sector are eager to face these challenges and to work together around it. So we hope that our work will help towards that, and that this kind of conversation will also build like more concrete initiatives. And just a very short slide on next steps at CartONG side. So to be a bit consistent with what we discussed, we are trying to pull out some data training for national and local CSOs. We are doing one with the Bioforce Institute, and like it's totally something we could collaborate with other H2H, so if you're interested. We continue to produce open source and free resources on our learning corner. So the upcoming one this year would be on gender and data, and a more technical one on Power BI, because as you say, Guido, everybody wants dashboards, so we cannot ignore that, unfortunately. And we have an ongoing cycle of training webinars on data needs, specifically for local organizations. So currently it's only in French because it's against the French Development Agency funding, but if any donor is in the room and wants to complement that to have English speaking or other languages, a webinar would be most happy. And you are, of course, most welcome to send feedback on the study and to inform for our future work, and also to send us if you produce studies on or research that could be of interest for our future reflections.
Thank you very much, Martin, and thanks a lot to Quito and Guido for the preparation and the elements they shared, and thanks to all of you, the participants, for your active reflections and the interest for this session. And thanks a lot to Anna to have make it happen in terms of tools and materials and presentations. So I think that's the end of our session. Definitely, it's a beginning of opportunities. Presentation is going to be shared, recording, links as well, and the different reports referred by our panelists. So we will send you a couple of things in the coming days, and we keep in touch. I'm sure we will have the opportunity to discuss it in the coming months, and perhaps through HNPW events in March at Geneva level. Thanks a lot, and have a great end of day for all of you. And we
have another session, like a bit different angle, but again around the study at the HNPW. So if you want to meet in person in Geneva, I will be very happy.
Fantastic. So we're going to send the reference of this session at the HNPW in the email with Anna, where we share with all the participants to make sure everybody is aware of. Have a great end of day. Take good care. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.